Can you imagine reading 22 books in just 30 days? Well, that's exactly what I did this September. And I can't wait to share all the page turners, plot twists, and surprises with you. Whether you're looking for your next binge read or just curious how I pulled it off, light a candle and let's dive into this reading frenzy together. So you would think, considering that I read 22 books last month, that I maybe would have read all of the books that I told you I was going to read in my September TBR. I did not. However, I will say that I have started them all. Now, the reason I didn't finish them is largely because of the format that I'm reading them in. I did a ton of cleaning last month, so I was listening to a lot of audiobooks. So the books that I was physically reading just kind of took a back seat. So the books that I told you I was going to read that I did not finish were Neon Ghosts by Daniel Green, The Ministry of Time by Callie Bradley, and Mistletoe Malarkey, who I can't remember the author at the moment and don't have my Kindle handy. Like I did last month, I'm going to give you the books in the order that I liked from least to most. If you're curious what my favorite book was, make sure you stick around until the end. My least favorite book of this month was A Demon in Silver by R.S. Ford. This tells the story of a young girl, Lavinia, who has a forbidden power, and everyone wants to get Lavinia and either kill her or use her power. So it was kind of like a Game of Thrones, except instead of, a kingdom, they're all fighting over a girl. I will say, this wasn't a bad book. It was actually pretty well written, a little info dumpy for my tastes, but that tends to happen in a lot of really high fantasy. And I was really invested in several of the characters' storylines until the climax of the story, where most of them died or got changed in some way to where I no longer cared. Between that and the fact that I don't really have much interest in what seems to be the overarching plot of this series, I've just decided not to continue it. And that's why I gave it 2 stars. I also gave My Lady Jane 2 stars. If you didn't watch my book versus adaptation video from September, this book is a historical fantasy that's based around Lady Jane Grey, who ruled England for 9 days after Edward VI died, before she was executed by Mary I. If you watched my book versus adaptation, then you already know how I felt about this book. It was overall cute, but honestly pretty lacking in substance. So now we're moving into my 3-star books, and that started with Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking by Malcolm Gladwell. I find it particularly difficult to summarize nonfiction books, but the idea of this book is that it was an exploration on what is known as thin slicing, which is basically like quick decision making based solely on unconscious thought. I have honestly been reading this book for years because I used to use it in English lessons with a private student, but I'm no longer teaching those lessons, so I decided to just finally finish this book and get it off of my currently reading list. My overall thoughts of this book is that it had a lot of really interesting concepts, and Malcolm uses a lot of really good scientific examples to prove his points. But I did find some points that Malcolm made to be very problematic. And overall, it was just a lot to read for the basic lesson of the story to be trust your instincts, but not too much. Next up, we have Foe by Ian Reid. This is what I would call a literary sci-fi set in the near future. A stranger comes to the house of a married couple named Hen and Junior, and he tells Junior that he is going on an expedition that will last several years. In an effort to make things easier for Hen, a replacement will be provided to her during this absence. And that's really all I can tell you about this book without spoilering things. As far as why I gave it 3 stars, I honestly found Junior, our point of view character, to be kind of insufferable. He is the definition of a man who is comfortable and doesn't want to see outside of what he thinks is true. But to be fair, I do think that's kind of the point of this book. I also will say I really liked what was insinuated by the ending. I can't say more than that without spoilers. In another example of why literary fiction just isn't really for Stephanie, even if it is speculative, we have Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. So this book follows a woman who gets reborn over and over and over again every time she dies, and we follow her life in the different loops throughout the end of World War I all the way up through World War II. And you really do get a deep dive into how different decisions change her life. I will say this book is beautifully written, but at the end of the day, I really had to struggle with what was the point. The book just kind of ends, and we never find out why she's going through these time loops, which I realize was not the purpose of the book, but for me, I want to know why this is happening. It wasn't very satisfying for me from a plot standpoint. So as I read the magical readathon prompts that I had set for my September TBR and finished the audiobooks really quickly, I decided to continue with reading prompts from the magical TBR to catch up. Do I realize that I'm doing it wrong? Yes. Do I care? No. Am I having a great time? Absolutely. So I had a few more prompts in order to finish Lightfall from 2022. I rolled a 6, which took me to the Pigeon Pub, which technically meant I didn't even really need to read anything. But since I was looking for the prompt for my next read, I decided to do a mood read, which is something that I do not do often. So I looked through my audiobooks and I settled on a 3-book kind of audiobook omnibus. I was trying to think of the word and it wasn't coming. And those 3 books were all fairy tale retellings, which is definitely a comfort microgenre for me. Now, I did end up giving all 3 of the books in this omnibus 3 stars, but I am going to talk about them in the order that I liked them from least to best. And this omnibus was the first 3 books in the Beyond Four Kingdoms series by Melanie Sellier. I'm pretty sure I said that last name wrong. Please forgive me if you see this, Melanie. So my least favorite of these 3 books was A Tale of Beauty and the Beast. This is the second book in the series, and it continues after the events of the first book, which I'll talk about in a minute. And you have your heroine, where she has essentially won a competition to marry the Beast, a prince whose kingdom is cursed, and everybody knows it's cursed, but nobody's seen the prince for years. So I will say it was refreshing to have your heroine know what she's walking into with this story. But overall, and this is a trend with this series so far for me, I loved the aspects that weren't the story, weren't from the original fairy tale. I think Melanie had some really interesting world building going on here. But as far as the plot itself, it felt a little too close to Disney's Beauty and the Beast as far as certain notes that it hit. So the 3rd book of the series is called A Crown of Snow and Ice, which is based on the tale of the Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen, where one of the princesses from the first book, which again, I'll get into that in just a minute, keep watching, has gone to visit 2 of the other princesses from the first book who are twin sisters and their older brother in a winter kingdom. Except as she gets to know these people a bit more, she's realizing that something isn't quite right. So I always love stories based on the Snow Queen. This is a very personal story to me. Every winter and Christmas, as we were decorating for the tree, my sister and I would pretend that we were playing as the Snow Queen. So I always think of my sister anytime I hear a Snow Queen retelling, which is why I really enjoyed going to see Frozen when I graduated from college with my sister. But again, I ran into this issue of I loved the original stuff that was put in there. It was so good. But once you got into the Snow Queen stuff, it was pretty lackluster. Now, my favorite of these 3 books was the first one, which is A Dance of Silver and Shadow. And this is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses. And that has always been one of my favorite fairy tales. So I'm already kind of predestined to like it a little bit more than some of the others. But what I really found interesting is that instead of them going out and being frivolous and dancing all night and ruining the shoes and being a big financial drain on the king, the main premise is that all of these princesses have been called because the prince from the Beauty and the Beast tale called a tournament for his future bride. So all of these princesses are competing in a tournament to be the bride of what everyone thinks is a cursed prince, and honestly an evil prince. So nobody really wants to be there. I think it was a really fun way to open up like a universe and a series to where you'll get to meet like the different heroines of each of the books and maybe some of the love interests, though I can't say for certain. And the romance develops really naturally in this story. The trials I could kind of take or leave. Some were really interesting and some were just like, okay. But it was just a fun, unique take on the fairy tale. And it really did something new with it, which is what I felt didn't happen with the other two books. So now we're moving into my 4-star books. So going back to Lightfall, after going to the Pigeon Pub, I rolled and ended up getting Wallace's Wonderful Winter Wanimals. I had to do one of the secondary prompts, which was have a zoo adventure, which meant to read a book that had an animal on the cover. So going through my Kindle, the first cover I found that had an animal on it was The Glass Witch by Lindsay Pouquet. Lindsay is an author tuber here on YouTube, and I really enjoy her writing content, so I highly suggest that you go and give her channel a shot. She is particularly a middle grade writer and seems to write about disabled characters, but in a really healthy, positive way. And this story follows a young witch whose mother is taking her to her grandmother's house while she goes and works a job for 3 months because her mother is a traveling nurse. And she's pretty upset by this. And you find out pretty quickly that the reason she and her mother do not live in the town with her grandmother and her aunt is because there is a curse on the town that if more than 3 good witches, that's their last name, are in the town, then it will basically kickstart a curse where the witch who crossed town lines while there were 3 witches in the town is hunted. Well, our heroine decides to test that theory and kickstarts the curse. So you follow her and her new friend as they run from the hunter and try to figure out how to break the curse before the hunter catches her. Also, side note, please forgive me for never remembering character names. I'm really bad with remembering names in general. And when you read so many books in 1 month, the details like names tend to vanish for me. Could I research the names before sitting down to record this video? Yes, I could. Am I going to? No, because that's what my ADHD brain says. Then I read The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher. And this tells the story of Mouse, whose grandmother, who is not a nice woman, dies, and she has to go at the pleading of her father, who is not really well enough to do it himself, empty out the grandmother's house. When she gets to the middle of nowhere in North Carolina, she finds out that her grandmother was a hoarder, so getting the house ready to sell is not going to be as easy as she thinks. But then strange things start to happen, and she starts seeing weird creatures out in the backwoods. And when she walks her dog in the woods one time, she ends up in a place that shouldn't exist where it is. So with the help of the neighbors across the street, she continues to empty out the house and uncovers the mystery of what's going on in the woods. So I was super excited that I was reading this book, especially considering that I got to meet T. Kingfisher at an event at my local bookstore in September. I got her newest novella signed, and I'm excited to read it. I haven't read it yet. But what I love about T. Kingfisher's horror in particular, and I told her this to her face, and she was just so chuffed by it because she's like, that's what I was going for, is she writes horror that is incredibly unsettling. All that being said, I couldn't give this book 5 stars because I honestly felt kind of unsatisfied by the explanation of what was going on. I feel like the buildup was so slow that the massive rush to the end meant that you didn't discover things quite to the level that you wanted them to be answered. Another 4-star read for me was My Happy Marriage, Volume 3 by Akumi Agitogi, and this tells the story of Mio, who enters into an arranged marriage with a very prevalent house, and she is surprised because her previous family kind of treated her like crap when she's treated very well by her fiance. There is a Netflix adaptation of this that is adorable. And I will say that this volume is still following the plot that the Netflix drama has as well. So this story was really cute, as per usual. I love the artwork. I love the story. It's just so sweet. What I do like about reading the manga versus watching the anime on Netflix is that you do get a lot more of the political backstory that's going on throughout the series in the manga, and you don't really get that in the anime. So one of the physical books that I did finish in September was Through the Woods by Emily Carroll. This is a really gorgeous graphic novel. It was recommended to me by Steph, who has an amazing YouTube channel that I'll link down below. And I will say, this graphic novel was visually stunning. I really liked all the stories. My favorite were His Face All Red and The Nesting Place. However, overall, I wish that there was a little bit more explanation of what was going on. A lot of the stories tended to just kind of end, and I think that's why His Face All Red and The Nesting Place were my favorites, because they had a bit more of that explanation that I was looking for. So back at Wallace's Wonderful Winter Wanimals, the genre there was to read a fantasy book. So I chose The Demon King by Cinda Williams Chima. And this tells the story about Han, who is a reformed thief who for some reason has always had these silver cuffs that he's worn, and he's never been able to take them off to sell because otherwise he would have. And one day he and his friends run into 3 young kind of wizard apprentices, and through a conflict, one of them drops an amulet and our young hero picks it up, and all sorts of chaos ensues. And I've known about this series for a long time, but I never really picked it up until a TikToker that I like, Andy Reads, keeps recommending it as one of her favorite kind of YA epic fantasies of all time. I will link her TikTok down below. I really liked all of the characters in this story. They felt like their ages, but not in a naive way. Like, they felt very genuine, like 15-year-olds. I will say the series is a bit slow to start, like most epic fantasy. And yes, I would call this epic fantasy more than I would call it YA, because the story reads more like an epic fantasy to me than a YA novel. And like a lot of epic fantasy, as the storylines begin to intertwine, things really start to pick up, and that's why I gave it 4 stars. Then we have The Girl from the Well by Rin Chupeco, which tells the story of a kind of vengeful spirit who protects children. Okay, protects children is wrong. I would say she punishes people who harm children. And she keeps getting drawn to this boy who has tattoos on his skin that were put there by his mother, who was a Shinto priestess. And as things with the tattoos start to go awry, our ghost kind of travels with him and his family as they try to go and figure out what's happening to him. I honestly don't know if I've ever read a horror story from the ghost's point of view before, but I would 100% read more. That being said, I don't know why, but I was kind of hoping there might be a tiny touch of romance, but there's not. So if you prefer your horror without any kind of romance and aren't looking for something, I mean, it's kind of graphic, but not outrageously graphic, I would pick this book up. I also did finish The Whispering Dead by Darcy Coates, which tells the story of, I think her name is Kira, when she wakes up without any memories of who she is and ends up going to a kind of pastor's house on the edge of a cemetery, and he gives her sanctuary in a cabin in the graveyard. And you find out through the course of events that our protagonist can actually see ghosts, and that there is kind of a murder mystery that needs to be uncovered in order for our protagonist to be safe. I don't know if cozy horror is a thing, but if it is, this is how I would describe cozy horror. It does have some moments that sent chills up my arms and like down my spine, but overall, it's just kind of a really good found family trope story with a little bit of a murder mystery thrown in there. I am really intrigued by kind of who Kira is and exploring these characters more, so I definitely plan on continuing this series. And this was actually the book that was picked to be the first book for my work book club. And a lot of the people in it have said that they've already started reading the second book. So after leaving Wallace's Wonderful Winter Animals, I rolled the dice and ended up in the Old Tales bookstore, which the genre for that location is mystery and thriller. And the next book on my list was for the prompt to ask the archivist for a recommendation, which meant that I needed to read a book that was recommended to me by someone. So I have a lot of friends who read mystery and particularly like cozy mystery, and I was in the mood for a cozy mystery. So I texted them and asked for recommendations and settled on Botanist's Guide to Parties and Poisons by Kate Kavari. So this series is set in 1920s London and follows Saffron Everly, who is the only female botanist at her university. And she attends a dinner party where the wife of one of the attendees is poisoned and subsequently dies. And when her mentor ends up getting blamed for the crime, Everly's gonna do whatever she can to prove him innocent. I absolutely love Saffron. She's everything you could kind of want from like a roaring 20s heroine. She's spunky, she's smart, but she's still a lady. And her love interest in this is kind of like a budding feminist, so I couldn't help but like them both a lot. And a lot of me liking a book is how well I like your characters. And I feel like this was kind of that perfect cozy mystery for me. It had just the right amount of stakes, but mostly was fun. All right, so I actually had five-star reads this month for me. The first one was Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This was actually a reread for me, but we were reading it for my sister's book club, and it had been a while since I initially read it, so I decided to reread it. Except the first time I read it, I listened to it, and the second time I actually physically read it. So if you're not familiar with this book, this tells the story of Noemi, who lives in Mexico, and her father sends her to her cousin, who has just recently been married, to visit because he received a rather distressing letter from her and wanted to make sure that she was okay. Well, Noemi goes to her cousin's house, and of course, nothing is okay. Was this still a 5-star book for me after physically reading it instead of listening to it? Maybe, but that's why I rated it the lowest of my 5 stars. And that's because I still really enjoyed it, so I'm not quite ready to move it down to a 4-star level. So for the generic mystery thriller prompt at the Old Tales bookstore, I read My Sister's Grave by Robert Dugoni. This is the first book in the Tracy Crosswhite series, and Tracy Crosswhite is a detective with the Seattle PD who became a detective because her sister vanished and disappeared. And she's never believed that the man who was accused of murdering her was actually her murderer. So now, 20 years after her sister's disappearance, her sister's body is finally found, and she has to uncover who actually murdered her sister. I was honestly really surprised by how much I liked this book. This isn't my normal type of thing. I don't normally read a lot of mysteries. And it does seem like the mysteries I do read, though, are part of a longer series, Mystery readers tell me, is this normal? Are most mysteries part of a series? But considering I did give this 5 stars, I definitely plan on continuing the series. So for the second extra prompt at the Old Tales bookstore, which was to read in the lounge, which meant that I had to read while cozied up under a blanket. But I ended up listening to Botanist Guides to Flowers and Fatality by Kate Kavari, which is the second book in the Saffron Everly mystery series. And I started this pretty much immediately after finishing the first book, once I saw that the prompt wouldn't stop me from continuing the series. And I'm so glad I did, because I actually ended up liking this one a little bit more than the first one, which is strange for me because there's a love triangle. And I don't normally like love triangles at all. But I was honestly torn between these two love interests for Saffron. And while the love triangle does get pretty much resolved by the end of the book, I'm really curious to see what happens next with these characters and if they'll even kind of be around for the next book. Okay, so that book and then the next book and then my favorite book, I honestly had a really hard time deciding between the 3 of them which was my favorite of the month. So I kind of think of all 3 of them as my favorite book of the month, but the next book that I gave 5 stars to was All Systems Red. Who wrote All Systems Red? By Martha Wells. Yes, I realized this was technically supposed to be on my October TBR, but I was finished with my latest audiobook, so I wanted to read it. And this series is a series of novellas centering around an android named Murderbot, set in the far future. And Murderbot is essentially a self-aware android who is set to protect scientists, or really set to protect whoever has his contract. Except because he's hacked his governor module, he goes along with things so that he doesn't get caught, but he really can do whatever he wants. And I don't know why I love characters who are like robots, who are self-aware. One of my favorite books of all time has a very similar type character, but I absolutely fall in love with characters like this. There's just something so human in their inhumanness, or rather in their belief that they are not human. Maybe human is the wrong word. Person. My only complaint about this novel is that I wanted it to be a novel and not a novella. I could have happily read a lot more of this story. Before I give you my favorite book of the month, tell me, what was your favorite book? Let me know in the comments, or if you just want to let me know that you're here, leave me a robot emoji. So my favorite book of the month was Artificial Condition by Martha Wells, which is the second book in the Murderbot's diaries. Yes, I read 2 of them when I wasn't even supposed to read 1 until this month. This continues the story of Murderbot after he leaves his party from the first book and ends up on a transport ship that also has an AI and kind of forming a friendship very begrudgingly over their love for dramas. I loved that in this second installation, we got to see more types of AI than just Murderbot, to see just how human he is, or maybe how not different he is from other AI. I'm sensing the overall storyline starting to build in the second installment. I still wish that this had been a full-length novel. So I realize that 22 book recommendations is a lot, and you've probably already decided which one of these you want to read. But if you're interested in some bold female protagonists, make sure you check out my August wrap-up. Let's see what stories tomorrow brings.